is Marcia Zerivitz, who will discuss the history of Jews in Jacksonville and Florida Jews in the military. Marcia Jo has a LHD and is the founding executive director of the Jewish Museum of Florida at FIU, Florida International University. She is a native of West Virginia and who has lived in Florida for more than half a century, although you'd never know by looking at her. She is a trailblazer in American and Floridian Jewish communities, serving national, state, and local organizations, and most proudly says she has broken the glass ceiling numerous times. Through her experience, she observed that Florida's Jewish community had a major challenge, its community, and resolved to focus on collecting and preserving the stories and material evidence of the contribution of Jews to the Sunshine State and beyond. From 1984 to 1992, Marcia Jo traveled 250,000 miles throughout Florida, conducting grassroots research and retrieving the history of the state's 250+ year Jewish history, resulting in a major archives, the Mosaic, MOSAIC, Jewish Life in Florida, traveling exhibit, and then in 1995, opening the Jewish Museum of Florida in Miami Beach. She developed the collections and presented more than 70 exhibits with 500 educational programs in 16 years. Marcia Jo initiated the legislation in both the Florida Jewish History Month every January and the Jewish American History Month each May to increase awareness of the contribution of Jews to the quality of life in Florida. Since her retirement, you retired? No, you haven't. Kind of, sort of. Since her retirement from the museum in 2011, she lives in St. Pete Beach. This cultural anthropologist continues to research, curate exhibits, lecture, and write articles, books, and films on Florida Jewish history and anti-Semitism. She was the main on-camera narrator for the PBS documentary, A Call to Serve, Florida's Jews in the U.S. military. On a side note, it's my honor to introduce to you Marcia Jo.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's great to be here. I want to make sure you can hear, first of all. Can you hear me really clearly? Great. Okay. It's an honor to be part of the 128th National Convention of the Jewish War Veterans. Since the Revolutionary War, Jews have served in all of America's conflicts for the democratic freedoms of our country and have always had a higher percentage in the military than their percentage in the population, as you know. Ignorance was the greatest hurdle for Jews in the military as they introduced America to Jews, as you know. Most servicemen had never met a Jew and actually thought Jews had horns. The actions and bravery by Jews showed that they were not different from others. Florida is home to many past national commanders, including Theodore Brooks, Stanley Zwiak, Daniel Heller, Ainsley Furdy, and David Magidson. I don't know if anybody else is here, but I know David is here, and it's really great to see you. And I know you were also past president of the board of the American Museum, National Museum of American Jewish Military History. Did I get it right? Good. Over the years, there have been many national conventions for the Jewish war veterans in Florida. This photo reflects one in 1939 at the Alamac Hotel in Miami Beach, but I doubt if any of you could have been there. I was happened to be born in 1939. These are a few more images that I had in my archives from the various JWV activities in Florida. Thousands of Floridian Jews have served in the U.S. military in all ranks, in the Army, Coast Guard, Marines, Navy, and Air Force. They displayed courage as officers and regular soldiers, nurses, doctors, and chaplains. The first conflicts for Jews in Florida were the Seminole Wars. I know nobody here served in that. Jews have continued their participation in defense of democracy and freedom, both on the war and home fronts. While serving, these Floridian Jews maintained the traditions of their heritage, even when it was challenging. Hundreds earned medals, 5 were prisoners of war, and 16 were killed in action. The Seminole Wars, also known as the Florida Wars, were 3 conflicts between the United States and Florida's Seminole Indians, ranging from 1817 to 1858. The Seminoles were eminent enemies of the new United States as they sided with the British during the American Revolutionary War, when Florida was a British territory. During the War of 1812, the British supplied the Seminoles with weapons and attacked in West Florida. About 15,000 Jews lived in the United States at that time, and probably less than 500 were in the military. But a Jew, U.S. Army Lieutenant Meyer M. Cohen, volunteered and was stationed in St. Augustine. He made detailed notes that became his book that provides a very clear eyewitness account of the conflict, including the history of the Seminoles and the U.S. Army's efforts to remove them. You are familiar with Uriah P. Levy, the first Jewish Commodore of the U.S. Navy, which at the time was the highest rank obtainable. A promoter of justice and human rights, he was instrumental in abolishing corporal punishment in the Navy. Levy prevailed against anti-Semitism from some of his fellow naval officers. During the Second Seminole War, from 1837 to 1839, Levy was the master commandant of the USS Vandalia, an 18-gun sloop of war, which cooperated with land forces in Florida and helped to suppress the late slave trade. The Commodore Uriah P. Levy Center and Jewish Chapel were dedicated in 2005 at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. Meet Abraham Charles Myers, for whom the city of Fort Myers is named. Did you know that? On the west coast of Florida. Born in South Carolina in 1811, Colonel Myers was the great-grandson of that state's first Hazen and an 1833 graduate of West Point. During the Second Seminole War, Second Lieutenant Myers engaged in battle with the Seminole Indians. He was promoted to captain, assistant quartermaster in 1839, stationed in St. Augustine, and made one trip to Southwest Florida. In 1849, Myers was made chief quartermaster of the Department of Florida and was stationed at Fort Brooke, which is Tampa, with General David Twiggs, who was his future father-in-law. He married the Twiggs's daughter. In 1850, General Twiggs ordered a new fort to be built in Southwest Florida on the Colusa River with the designation of Fort Myers. That's how the city got its name. Colonel Myers remained in the Army until January of 1861, when he resigned to join the Confederacy. He was made the first quartermaster general of the Confederate Army. He set up an elaborate supply network, but due to a shortage of supplies throughout the South, he was released from duty in August of 1863. The Confederate Congress recommended Myers for promotion to brigadier general, but President Jefferson Davis instead removed him from office. Myers refused to serve in a subordinate position, was dismissed, and remained bitter for the rest of his life. Before we delve further into the military chapter of Florida Jewish history, I will give you some background. The word history, as you can see, contains the word story. Jews are storytellers, and the story of Florida Jewish history had been hidden, undiscovered. I ask a lot of questions. Jews ask a lot of questions, don't we? And then I spent 8 years between 1984 and 1992 on the road, traveling throughout Florida to set up and manage volunteer task forces for the grassroots research, to collect oral histories, photographs, documents, and artifacts that flesh out this wonderful story. And that was before cell phones, Google, and Wikipedia, if you can imagine that. After 36 years of research and experience in telling the stories of Jewish life in Florida through the Mosaic Traveling Exhibit, and then creating and managing the Jewish Museum of Florida on South Beach, I wrote a book. Why did I write a book? First, even though Florida is the nation's third largest Jewish community with about 800,000 Jews, which is about 3.4% of the state's population, and it's the first place where Jews arrived in what became the United States, no one else had done the research and recorded the history. Second, to debunk myths, like the notion that the history started on Miami Beach post-World War II. And in reality, it was St. Augustine 348 years prior. Third, it is important to have Jewish memories for Jewish continuity. And fourth, because it is timely, with a staggering rise in anti-Semitism. So when did Florida Jewish history begin? Most are not aware that Jews could not live in Florida for 250 years after Florida was discovered in 1513. That is when Ponce de Leon first reached the Florida coast, probably between today's Daytona Beach and Melbourne, found the natives hostile, and named the new land La Florida after Pascua Florida, which means the Feast of Flowers, because it was Easter time. Since this was during the Inquisition, which is 1478 to 1834, and Ponce de Leon sailed for Spain, which then owned Florida, only Catholics could live in Florida for the next 250 years. We were taught in religious school that the first Jews arrived in America in 1654 in New Amsterdam that became New York, after sailing from Recife, Brazil, to escape the Inquisition there. We now have evidence that there were conversos, or secret Jews, hoping to escape the Spanish Inquisition, who made their way to St. Augustine with Ponce de Leon, as there are Spanish Jewish names on the list of soldiers and settlers there in 1565, when the city was founded. Historians note that the third governor of Florida, Pedro Menendez Marquez, who lived from 1577 to 1589, could have been a converso. We now know, because of research, that Antonio Martinez Carvajal, who was the chief harbor pilot in St. Augustine from 1577 and 78, was the first person of Jewish descent to live in what would become the United States. That's in St. Augustine, and it's 77 years prior to Jews arriving in New York, which, as I mentioned, was 1654. Jews could not live in Florida as Jews until 1763. That is when the Treaty of Paris was signed following the French and Indian War. And in this treaty, Spain ceded Florida to Britain, and people other than Catholics could finally settle here, including Jews. These 1765 Pensacola minutes reflect the names of 3 Sephardic Jews who arrived in Pensacola in 1763. Alexander Solomons, Joseph D. Palacios, and Samuel Israel bought property and stores and did business with the British and others, selling wood and dry goods. In 1822, a Jewish girl, Virginia Myers, was born in Pensacola, the earliest recorded Jewish birth I could find. 200 years ago, 26 years before 1845 statehood of Florida, one Jew took advantage of the development opportunities here. No photo exists of Moses Levy, only this house drawing based on his writings. In 1820, a year before Florida became a United States territory, Moroccan-born Moses Levy began purchasing 100,000 acres that spread from around Gainesville, south to Sanford, and west to Tampa Bay. Levy formed the Florida Association, the very first development corporation in Florida. Moses Levy was the most important person in early Florida Jewish history. In 1822, he built his 1,000-acre pilgrimage plantation just south of Gainesville. It was intended as a refuge for oppressed European Jews to become farmers in a communitarian settlement, the first on U.S. soil. Its main commodity was sugarcane, and Moses Levy had reintroduced that to Florida. Frederick Warburg of the famous German banking family was his recruiting agent in Europe, and he lived at Pilgrimage. Moses Levy was Florida's first education commissioner, an advocate of public schools, and instrumental in establishing Florida's first free public school in St. Augustine. This is 54 years after Florida Jews settled in Florida. Then came the Seminole Wars. Pilgrimage, his plantation, was destroyed at the beginning of the Second Seminole War in 1835. Moses Levy was the father of David Levy Yulee, the first U.S. senator from Florida and the first Jewish U.S. senator in American history. There have only been 2 Jewish senators from Florida. The second was Miami's Richard Stone. David moved to Pilgrimage at the age of 17 and lived there for 4 years, helping his father run the plantation. During his 20s, Levy served in the territorial militia, including during the Second Seminole War. Then he wanted to become an attorney. There were no law schools at that time. You had to apprentice. So he went to Tallahassee and he apprenticed and was admitted to the bar and got involved in politics. Florida became the 27th state in 1845 under the leadership of David Levy Yulee. He helped draft Florida's Constitution and worked very hard for statehood when there were about 60,000 people in Florida. That included about 100,000, included 100 Jews, 100. He faced anti-Semitism in the United States Senate. Vice President John Quincy Adams referred to him as that alien Jew delegate from Florida, even though he had gone through citizenship proceedings twice. He served as senator until the secession of Florida from the Union. Yulee was the family's ancestral name for Morocco, which he added to his name Levy when he went to Washington. David Levy Yulee was important both in politics and the economy in Florida. In 1861, he formed Florida Railroad Company, the first cross-state rail system that went from Fernandina on the East Coast to Cedar Key on the West Coast. So goods arriving from Europe for the first time could be shipped across the state instead of the very treacherous route around the tip down around Key West. The railroad operated for 80 years. There are places around Florida named in his honor, and during World War II, there was a U.S. Liberty ship named for David Levy Yulee. This Florida map tells a very large story. It reflects the sequence of the earliest documentation I could find of Jewish life in communities around the state. The first, as I mentioned, in Pensacola in 1763. Then we have Micanopy in 1819. I mentioned Moses Levy. He was a founder of Micanopy, and his plantation was right next to Micanopy. St. Augustine and Tallahassee in the 1830s. Key West in the 1840s, and Jacksonville, where you are, 1841. And the reason that those two places, Key West and Jacksonville, were early ports of immigration is that these ships could come into the ports there. They were port cities. And so they were both in 1841. Tampa, 1844, which is still 48 years before South Florida. If you notice, I have not mentioned South Florida because there was no South Florida yet. Ocala, North Central Florida, 1850s. Orlando, 1865, right after the Civil War. Palm Beach and Miami, both 1892. And those were both in anticipation of Henry Flagler's railroad that was coming down the East Coast. And that's what brought, for example, many Russian Jews that had gone to New York heard about the railroad opening up South Florida, and they came first to West Palm Beach. And then when the railroad was extended to Miami in 1896, many of them moved to Miami. So we have St. Petersburg, where I live, 1901. We have Davie in Broward County in 1910. And then Sarasota and Miami Beach, 1913. Fort Lauderdale, 1915. And this was the biggest surprise to me. Boca Raton, which now has the largest Jewish, anyone here from Boca? Has the largest Jewish population in the state. And it did not have a Jew there till 1931. And then we have Southwest Florida in the Fort Myers, Naples area, which Jews did not settle until the 1950s because of the restrictive covenants there. Since the founding of Jacksonville in 1822, Jews have played a prominent role in the development of civic life here. They have served their city by defending it against invasion during the Civil War and World War II, by holding public offices, by building the economy, and by contributing to the cultural arts, education, and philanthropies. Jacksonville became the most important city in northern Florida in the late 19th century. Jews came to Jacksonville as merchants before the Civil War and suffered the same fate as others by Union troops who occupied the city. Although yellow fever epidemics, freezes, and a devastating fire retarded growth, the city continued to grow and attract new residents. From the period following the Civil War and following the 1901 fire until the mid-1930s, Jacksonville was the center of Jewish life for the entire state. That might surprise you. Attracted by business opportunities offered by the port city, Jews migrated here via the St. Johns River and the railroad, and most were in retail. Tourism, the lumber industry, and military bases continued the appeal. Florida's first Jewish organization was this cemetery here in Jacksonville in 1857. 7 Confederate veterans are buried in this cemetery. In 1880, there were 130 Jews here, well integrated into the business, social, professional, and cultural life of the city. And it was time to start a congregation, Ahaveth Hesed, founded in 1882. Jewish communal organizations are formed to perpetuate Jewish life, culture, and traditions to ensure Jewish continuity. This original 1914 YMHA is the oldest building still standing in Jacksonville of significance to the Jacksonville Jewish community. Purim balls were held here. And in 1918, Fannie Moss spent 3 months collecting seashells to make this dress for the Purim party. I gathered the history by conducting nearly 1,000 oral histories and collecting material evidence to back up the stories. One example, it's 1986, and I'm here in Jacksonville interviewing Rosalie and Robert Coleman about his grandfather, George Delinsky. In 1857, George was the first boy born in Florida to a Jewish family that planted roots in the state and has continued to live here as Jews since 1850. I asked if they had any of George's personal possessions. Rosalie chimes in, I have his pocket watch with Hebrew numerals that he carried his entire life. It's in the safety deposit box at the bank, and no one in the family knows that I have it. Would you like to see it? I say, absolutely. And at the bank, I ask if our Mosaic Jewish Life in Florida project could borrow it and display it in the traveling exhibition. She says yes. And then in 1995, when we created the Jewish Museum of Florida on Miami Beach, I asked if she would donate it to the collections. She said yes. The important thing to know is that this is how the material evidence and collective historic memories of more than 250 years of Jewish life in Florida were retrieved, piece by piece. The family continues to live in Jacksonville and has 75 descendants in Florida into the 8th generation. The Moses Levy family, who I mentioned earlier, is no longer Jewish. So who is the longest continuing Jewish family in Florida? The Delinsky family, who came, as I mentioned, in 1850. Philip Delinsky, in the top left, was the first one in the family to permanently settle here in Jacksonville. And then he brought his father. His mother, unfortunately, died in the crossing across the Atlantic. And he brought 8 siblings. Philip married a Jewish woman, Ida Ehrlich. Their children born in Jacksonville were George, who's sitting on the chair in the top center photo, the one who had the pocket watch, He was born in 1857, if you remember. And Regina, his sister, was born in 1859. That's Regina standing beside him. In the top right is Philip's brother, Morris, who worked on a farm until the Civil War, when he was enlisted as a private with the Madison Gray Eagles, which became Company G of the 3rd Florida Infantry Regiment. Private Delinsky served under General Bragg in the Kentucky campaign and was severely wounded in the Battle of Perryville. Following the war, he returned to Jacksonville, got into the mercantile business, and organized the city's first volunteer fire department. In 1882, Delinsky was founding president of Ahavith Hesed, and at the same time served as Jacksonville's mayor. He was also a municipal court judge. In the lower right is their sister, Helena. Helena Delinsky married Robert Williams, a Jew who served in the Civil War, and then became a cotton plantation owner in Tallahassee. Did you know Jews were cotton plantation owners? They had 5 daughters, and this is the most remarkable thing I could find, that they all married Jews. This is in the 1800s in Florida. Truly remarkable, with so few Jews in the mid-19th century, and a statement of their adherence to tradition. In spite of not being wanted in Florida, Jews have contributed hugely to the history, development, and fun facts of the Sunshine State. There are many firsts by Floridian Jews, like the first Miss Florida in 1885, who was another daughter of Helena and Robert Williams, and she's by this time a 3rd-generation Floridian Jew. 120 years later came another Jewish Miss Florida, also from Jacksonville, Mari Walensky, in 2005. Her family has a long history here in Jacksonville. On the right is the shop of her great-grandfather in 1905, who was the first optician in Jacksonville. With about 175 years of Jewish history, Jacksonville can boast of having 6, 7, and 8 generations, and today has a Jewish population of about 13,000. Jewish men fought for both sides during the Civil War, and some Jacksonville Jews fled the North to fight on the Union side. Nationally, approximately 3,000 Jews served in the Confederacy and 7,000 for the Union. Confederate Army Lieutenant Michael Levy left Germany to avoid conscription in the Army, then enlisted after he arrived in the United States to demonstrate his patriotism. That happened often. I'm sure you know many of those stories. He was detailed as an ordnance officer. In 1865, he mustered out in Milton, Florida, which is very North Florida, married and settled in Pensacola, where he was the founder of Florida's first Jewish congregation. His sons purchased property in downtown Pensacola that remains in the family today. He was kosher and carried this pewter pot throughout the war to make his hot chocolate. Another Jacksonville Jew who served in the Civil War was Confederate Army Private Isidore Grunthal, who enlisted on July 10th of 1863. He fought under Generals Stonewall Jackson and PGT Beauregard and invented a primer that was used for cannon all through the war. Grunthal went into the wholesale grocery business in Jacksonville with his brother. He served 8 years as a police commissioner and served on the city council. On the right is Raphael Jacob Moses, who came to St. Joseph, Florida in the 1830s as a merchant. During the Civil War, he was responsible for supplying and feeding 54,000 men. Moses was tasked with carrying out the last order of the Confederate government, the delivery of $40,000 in gold bullion to Union forces to be used for the benefit of Confederate soldiers and hospitals. On the left is Confederate Army Lieutenant Albert Moses Luria, a son of Raphael Moses, who was born in Apalachicola, Florida. He was the first Confederate Jew killed during the Civil War in June of 1862. And then in the center are nephews of Raphael Moses, Isaac, Joshua Lazarus, and Perry Moses. Each joined the Confederate Army after attending the Citadel, the South Carolina Military Academy. Lieutenant Joshua Moses, in the circle, was the last Confederate Jew killed during the Civil War. The three brothers were stationed in Alabama when Joshua died on April 9th, 1865, while defending Mobile, Alabama at Fort Blakely. Florida served as a staging ground for the war with troops based in Jacksonville and Tampa during the Spanish-American War. There were 30 Jewish Army and 20 Navy officers among the 5,000 Jews who served in the Spanish-American War. When the high holidays approached, there were 4,000 requests for furloughs to attend services. This is the letter granting furlough for Private Cohen. It says, "The division commander instructs me to notify you that you are authorized to grant a furlough to Private Isidore Cohen for 10 days with permission to apply for an extension of 5 days. This if approved of by his company and regimental commanders." A native of Pensacola, Sergeant Heinberg, mustered into service on May 23rd, 1898, with Company H, 1st Regiment Florida Volunteer Infantry, stationed in Tampa. Private Manny Brash served in Florida State Troops. Born in Apalachicola, Florida in 1868 and a lifetime resident there, Brash owned and operated the Brash Bargain House, a dry goods store. His father, Henry, had served in the Confederate Army. These are his United Spanish War Veterans Medal and Discharge Certificate. During all this time in the 19th century, Jews continued to settle in Florida. A major pioneer family are the Benjamins, represented well here tonight. Born in Prussia, Simon Benjamin, who's in the insert, lived from 1850 to 1931. He immigrated to Florida in 1865. He came to Alachua County to establish a business in the village of Waldo. Simon stayed in Waldo for 3 years until he was literally run out of town by the Ku Klux Klan and moved to Ocala, where he had other family members. In 1888, Simon and other family members opened Florida's first known ice making plant using water from Howard Springs. Imagine, this was a time when there were no refrigerators in which to store and preserve meats or electricity to operate them, even if they had existed. Many homes contained ice boxes, and the Benjamins delivered ice on wagons. Simon was president of the temple in Ocala and on the school board. Simon moved his family, Simon is in the center circle. He moved his family into Jacksonville right after the big fire in 1902, 1 year after the fire that occurred it was the largest fire in the South that destroyed about 2,000 buildings here in Jacksonville and left 10,000 people without homes. Simon Benjamin began a cigar and tobacco business and served as president of Congregation Ahaveth Hesed here. Can you imagine serving as president twice of 2 different congregations? His son, Roy Benjamin, who's on the left in the red circle, became an acclaimed architect and is credited with the design of many notable buildings in Jacksonville and throughout the Southeast. Roy Benjamin designed more than 200 movie theaters, one in nearly every Florida town. In Jacksonville, he was the architect for the Imperial Theater, which is demolished, the Palace Theater, demolished, the Riverside Theater, demolished, the San Marco Theater, the Arcade Theater, and he was associate architect for the Florida Theater. After 84 and a half years, the San Marco recently closed just this past December due to diminishing attendance as a result of COVID and streaming. The 3 Jacksonville native sons of Roy and Phyllis Meyer Benjamin, George, Roy Jr., and Ted, all served in World War II. After the war, George settled in Orlando. George's daughter, Joy, is my daughter-in-law, and she and her husband, Don, have 2 sons, Benjamin and Ted, who are 5th generation Floridian Jews. And Joy Benjamin Zerivitz is here. Joy, you want to wave? George's brother, Ted Benjamin, documented his World War II experiences in the Army infantry in a booklet called The War That Was. And Joy has a copy if anybody wants to see it. During World War II, Roy Benjamin Jr. was captain of a submarine chaser, searching to destroy any German subs that approached the coast of Florida. He was a roommate of Arvin Rothschild, who married Roy Jr.'s sister, Margaret. That is Arvin on the left, who was the Army Military Police in Panama. His proud children, fourth generation Floridian Jews, Jane and Michael Rothschild, are here tonight. And Barbara, y'all want to stand? The three children. We'll wave at least. Before World War II, we had the war to end all wars. From 1914, the American Jewish community raised $63 million to assist the victims of the European war. During World War I, Jews made up 5.73% of the armed forces and served at a higher proportion, 7.38%, than the general population, which was 4.2%. In other words, Jews served higher than their percentage of the population, which was typical. And Florida's Jews were part of this. At the close of the 1920s, Jacksonville boasted a Jewish population of at least 3,700, the largest in Florida. When World War I broke out, Polish immigrant Alexander Brest was drafted and sent to Camp Joseph E. Johnston here in Jacksonville and fell in love with the area. Brest was a self-made multimillionaire, who first taught civil engineering at the University of Florida, and in 1924 formed Duval Engineering and Contracting Company in Jacksonville. He built more than 2,000 miles of roads and streets, including the first road to Cape Canaveral's first missile launching platform. He helped build Jacksonville Naval Air Station and other military facilities around the state. He helped change the face of Jacksonville by funding a planetarium, an art gallery, and a large city park, and Jacksonville University. Abraham M. Sonnabend had flight training in Miami and Pensacola, Florida, then was part of the Northern Bombing Squadron. Right after the war, he founded the Sonesta hotel chain on Key Biscayne, Florida. Sonesta is a combination of Sonnabend and his wife's name, Esther. I'm sure many of you have stayed in Sonesta hotels, now you know. And the hotel chain was handed down to his three sons and is now the 8th largest hotel chain in the world, with 1,200 properties and 100,000 guest rooms in 8 countries. Some more Jews, Florida Jews serving in World War I, Joseph Abramowitz, Bertram Danhauser, and Sam Gardner. And some more, Matt Katz, William Wolfson, and Samuel Wanish. I mentioned that Florida has had 2 Jewish Florida senators, US senators. The second, as I mentioned, was Richard Stone, who served from 1975 to 1980. Here's Senator Stone, who's on the left, presents Sergeant Herman Edelstein of Fort Lauderdale his long overdue Silver Star Medal, earned for bravery in combat in France during World War I. Although recommended in 1919, Edelstein did not receive his star until 1977 due to an anti-Semitic commanding officer. Sergeant Edelstein joined the Army in 1915, fought against Pancho Villa's troops under General John Pershing during the Mexican expedition of 1916 and 17. He then went to France and served as a gunnery sergeant. Other Floridians who have earned the Silver Star include Lieutenant Robert Richter, Sergeant Marvin Roth, Captain Harold Rubin, Private Fred Schrager, Captain Ellis Zacharias. Those are all World War II. And then Sergeant Robert Levy and Lieutenant William Wachter from Vietnam. Between the 2 world wars, Jews in Florida, as all others, were living their lives and pursuing their occupations. Jews in Florida have, from the beginning, made a living in retail and wholesale goods, first as peddlers. Then the peddlers transitioned to mom and pop stores around 130 years ago. Jack Proctor came from Warsaw, Poland to America in 1905 at age 8. He married Celie in Jacksonville, and together they operated the Jack Proctor store on Myrtle Avenue here in Jacksonville. One son, Sam, the little boy in the center, grew up to teach Florida history at the University of Florida for more than 50 years. During World War II, Proctor served at Camp Blanding near Stark, Florida, giving illiterate recruits a basic education in reading and arithmetic. There were large department stores opened by Florida Jews. Furchtgott opened here in Jacksonville while Union forces still occupied the city between 1864 and 1869. Austrian-born Hermann Max and Leopold Furchtgott and Charles Benedict began selling carpets and dry goods, and they opened many branches. Furchtgott's history was intertwined with Jacksonville's for more than 100 years. Samuel and Morris Cohen arrived in Jacksonville from Ireland in 1867. Also in Jacksonville was still under military occupation, and first established a very small Cohen Brothers store. They instituted fixed pricing rather than typical bargaining. Then, in 1912, they built this mammoth department store occupying a city block. It was the largest structure here in Jacksonville at one time, and at one time, the 9th largest department store in the United States. And in 1997, the building became Jacksonville's City Hall, which it is today. Jacksonville was an early center of the national motion picture industry, and this attracted Louis Mendelson to move here from Live Oak in 1901, right after the fire. In 1912, he founded Mendelson Printing Company, and with Morris Gellerter in 1924 started the Florida Jewish News for the dissemination of Jewish cultural information and news for the southern states. Land for Jacksonville Naval Air Station was originally purchased for the military use in 1907. Comprising 3,800 acres, it has brought tens of thousands of Jews and new faces to the city. Many of them were Jewish. They married Jacksonville Jews, started businesses, raised family, and became an integral part of the Jewish and civic community. A few individuals continued in the military and had outstanding careers. By 1945, there were about 3,095 Jews in Jacksonville. Once again, American Jews joined the war effort, both as soldiers and civilians. Of the 16 million Americans who served, more than 500,000 were Jews. Again, a higher percentage of portion than the general public, 12.22% to the general public of 9.63%. And roughly 52,000 received U.S. military awards. Many of those were Floridian Jews who served in all theaters of operations: the American Theater, European, African, Middle Eastern Theater, and Asiatic Pacific Theater. On the home front, Jews did their part, like all patriotic Americans, by buying bonds, conducting scrap metal drives, and entertaining the troops. Jacksonville became a major military hub. After the war, the Jacksonville Jewish population was about 4,000. Only about 1.3 of the local population. The U.S. entered the war on December the 8th, 1941, following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, as you know. On the left, Lieutenant Schwartz was in medical school when he was ordered to active duty with the Marine Corps and sent to Hawaii. Lieutenant Schwartz was the officer of the guard on Sunday, December the 7th. After inspecting the sentries and while waiting for his breakfast, the Japanese began their attack on Pearl Harbor. He organized his men to man the gun batteries. Lieutenant Schwartz made it out alive, only to be later stationed on Midway Island and participate in later battles. On the right, Sergeant Stein joined the Army in 1940. He was assigned to the Army Medical Department and requested Hawaii. On December the 7th, 1941, he was shaken from his bed at 7:55 a.m. as the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor began. Then Sergeant Stein was sent to Europe and participated in the Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1945. Both men lived in Florida and were frequent speakers on their military experiences. There are so many stories of Floridian Jews in World War II. Each Florida community has lists of those Jews who served. This is the list from Jacksonville's conservative congregation. And this is the list from Temple Ahavath Hesed, the Reform congregation. Some families sent 3 and 4 children to war. I already talked about the Benjamins, and there were also Jacksonville siblings Reinhardt, Moskowitz, and Wolfson, and the Rosenblatts of Tampa in the top photo. Army Air Force Major Charles Rosenblatt in the center, in the red circle, flew 102 combat missions and was awarded this Distinguished Flying Cross twice and the Air Medal 4 times. He also served as a fighter pilot during the Korean War and retired to Jacksonville as a colonel after 22 years of service. On this temple list is the name of Felix Glickstein. During the 8 years I traveled around Florida to gather the history, I sometimes stayed with Pat Glickstein, showed here in the photo, with Felix. She had this 1916 photo of her husband, Jacksonville native Felix Glickstein, when he was 2 years old, sitting on an alligator, which happens to be the symbol of Florida. So I felt this was absolutely perfect for our mosaic traveling exhibit, the symbol of Florida, a native-born Florida boy. So I put it on the catalog cover, the mosaic traveling exhibit. Felix Glickstein grew up to be a dentist here, and during World War II, he was stationed on various Hawaiian islands, including Hickam Field, adjacent to Pearl Harbor. His son Paul is here. Where's Paul? There's Paul. In 1925, Leonard Robbins' father opened a men's store in Fort Lauderdale, where Leonard graduated from high school. He enlisted as a flying cadet in July 1942 and began his training at Morrison Field in Palm Beach. Robbins was a navigator of a B-24 Liberator bomber with the 721st Bombardment Squadron. He flew 50 combat missions. He told me, quote, I was over all the other navigators in the squadron. When we fly, we lead the whole shebang, which makes the success or failure of our entire group rest on my shoulders, end quote. He earned a Distinguished Flying Cross with an oak leaf cluster. After the war, Robbins went to the University of Florida and then received his law degree from Harvard Law School. He had a successful law practice in Hollywood, Florida. Moses Alter of Miami was the chemical officer for aircraft bombs who taught chemical warfare and tactics. Here in this photo, Alter was with the B-29 Enola Gay on August the 7th, 1945, the day after it had dropped the first atomic bomb, codenamed Little Boy, on Hiroshima. 2 days later, on August the 9th, the B-29 Boxcar dropped the second atomic bomb, Fat Man, on Nagasaki. And on August 15th, Japan surrendered unconditionally, ending the war. Alter received many medals. Norman Brown graduated from Miami High School in 1942 and enlisted in the Navy as an apprentice seaman. He served with Torpedo Squadron 9, the VT-9, aboard the Brown was killed in a plane collision at Katina, Okinawa, Japan, during a bombing attack March 26, 1945. In his memory, the Jewish War Veterans Post in Miami is renamed for him, as well as the Ladies Auxiliary. William Katz, native of Jacksonville, enlisted in the Army Air Corps in 1942 and graduated from flying school. He became a B-17 Flying Fortress bomber pilot, flying 25 missions over Germany. Katz was promoted to captain and served as a group commander in the 8th Air Force. He earned the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters. In 1948, Katz volunteered for the Israeli Air Force. After the War of Independence, he settled in Israel and became chief pilot for El Al Airlines. On the right, you see a picture of his mom, Tilly Katz. In January of 1963, this was featured in a full-page New York Times ad for El Al Airlines. And it says, it's a whole paragraph about how he grew up and he was always playing with airplanes, always wearing an air uniform. And in the last line, it says, if you see him on an El Al flight, please tell him to dress warm. This is one of those did you know Signaling searchlights were used extensively in defense against nighttime bomber raids during World War II. The SSL was a 20-inch diameter powerful lamp with a shutter device to flash semaphore messages back to a ship once an invading landing party arrived on shore. U.S. Navy Admiral Hyman Rickover announced a design contest, and U.S. Metal Products entered. This company was owned by Leon Lapidus, who asked his oldest son, Morris, to take a year off from his architectural practice to be the engineer on the lamp design. The Navy required that a prototype be able to withstand the severe conditions of landing and gunfire. Their prototype, the Lapidus one, was the only submission that withstood the testing, and they were awarded the production contract. Morris Lapidus became an internationally known architect who designed many of the Miami Beach resort hotels, including the Eden Rock and the Fontainebleau and the Lincoln Road Mall. Rabbi Sidney Lefkowitz was the first Jewish chaplain to participate in the liberation of a concentration camp, Camp Dora, near Nordhausen, Germany. He was awarded a Bronze Star and ended his career as a major. After the war, Lefkowitz spent 27 years here in Jacksonville at Congregation Ahavath Hesed, the years 1946 to 1973. This is a very historic photo. Have any of you ever seen this photo? I think someone raised their hand. On October the 29th, 1944, Rabbi Sidney Lefkowitz conducted a Yom Kippur service for 300 American soldiers, the first Jewish service in occupied Germany. The Allies cracked Hitler's West Wall September 15th, breaching the Siegfried Line near Aachen, the site of a synagogue the Nazis had burned in 1938. This service, broadcast live by NBC, was conducted as German warplanes strafed and bombed nearby. The group dove for cover when a bomb burst too close. Artillery shells fell 200 yards away, and American fighters shot down 3 German planes from the sky, all during the service. The rabbi said, and I quote, "Our services on conquered German soil, where millions of innocent Jews died during 12 incredible years of Nazism, commemorate our indestructible faith in God and country," end quote. Yes, Floridian Jewish women also served. Hannah Becker, Connie Gordon, and Sidney Levitov, who was the first Florida woman to be sworn into the Navy. I thought that was interesting. Also, Nell Friedman from Tampa. These 5 Floridian Jews were taken as prisoners of war during World War II. Jerry Jacobs, Martin King, Fred Schrager, Seymour Lechtenfeld, and Jack Rubin. U.S. Army Technician 3rd grade Staff Sergeant Alfred Cohn grew up in Miami Beach and attended the University of Florida, where he received a degree in journalism. He enlisted in the Army in 1942 and served as a correspondent for Stars and Stripes. After being promoted to managing editor, he volunteered to report on the invasion of southern France by the 36th Infantry Division. While trying to get his story, Cohn was killed by enemy machine gun fire on August 29th, 1944. He was the only University of Florida journalism graduate to be killed in action, and the only known Floridian among the 45 war correspondents killed during World War II. Cohn was awarded the Purple Heart. There is a student lounge at the University of Florida named in his honor, and 2 University of Florida journalism scholarships are set up there in his name. And of course, so many Jews served on the home front in many capacities: war bond sales, scrap metal drives, entertainment, Red Cross, blood drives, and more. Following World War II, the Korean Peninsula was divided at the 38th parallel into Soviet and U.S. zones of occupation. This war claimed 37,000 American lives and left 103,000 wounded. Captain Zundel served with the Army Medical Corps. The day before Rosh Hashanah in 1951, he was chosen to transport 30 Jewish boys to services 40 miles away over a hazardous road north of the 38th parallel into North Korea, where they joined 300 other Jewish boys for services. Approximately 30,000 Jews served in the Vietnam War. Among more than 3 million, 269 Jews died. In this photo, in the red circle, U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Matt Bierman is with his crew. He flew 100 combat missions as a navigator during World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. He was last stationed at McCoy Air Force Base in Orlando, Florida, and retired there. Jacksonville native Michael Rothschild is a son of Arvin Rothschild, who I introduced you to later, shown in World War II, and a fourth-generation Floridian Jew. He was in the ROTC at Tulane University, and when he entered the Army, he went to the transportation school. Michael landed in Vietnam in 1968 on the day the Tet Offensive began. He served as a convoy officer in a motor pool that transported fuel in 5,000-gallon tanker trucks. Michael is here. On the right, Lillian and Abe Tarler, the Lillian and Abe Tarler family moved to Fort Lauderdale in 1939. Michael went into the Air Force in 1959. He clocked 5,000 hours as a navigator of a C-130 Hercules. He retired as a major in 1979 in Broward County and was awarded 7 medals. His brother Kevin also served in the Air Force. Navy Lieutenant William Wachter attended the University of Florida, then joined the Navy in 1961, flying search and rescue helicopters during the Vietnam War. On the right, Lieutenant Wolf of Bay Harbor Islands served as a supply officer of the USS Platte, a refueling ship for the 7th Fleet, serving in the South Pacific. Star basketball player Tilden Zane of Miami Beach enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserve in 1965 and saw duty aboard the USS Sandoval in the Caribbean and Mediterranean. While aboard, he was named the champion middleweight boxer. In October of 1966, Private Zane was transferred to Vietnam, where less than 2 months later, he was killed in action near Da Nang. Many Jews served during the Cold War. One example, Specialist Anderson grew up on Miami Beach, and after graduation from Miami Beach High School, he was inducted into the Army in 1959. He served overseas as a medic in Okinawa and earned many medals. In 2003, U.S. forces invaded Iraq, vowing to destroy Iraqi weapons of mass destruction and end the dictatorial rule of Saddam Hussein. 7 Floridian Jews were killed during this occupation, 6 young men and 1 woman. 5th generation U.S. Army Specialist Warshaw was a Gainesville native who served from 1999 to 2002 with the Army's 82nd Airborne Division. In 2002, he joined the Florida National Guard and was deployed to Iraq. His unit was one of the first to enter Iraq at the beginning of the war. Specialist Warshaw was killed while accompanying U.S. officials on a visit to Baghdad University in July 2003. On the left, Specialist Agami of Parkland, Florida, enlisted in the Army in 2005. In 2006, he deployed to Iraq in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Known as the Hebrew Hammer and GI Jew, because he was so strongly identified as a Jew, Agami was killed when his Humvee detonated an improvised explosive device, an IED, in June 2007. More than 2,000 people attended his funeral. In his honor, the Coconut Creek Post Office was renamed the Army Specialist Daniel J. Agami Post Office Building. On the right, no, on the center, is Corporal Schrag of Indian Harbor Beach, Florida, reported for his first official day as a Marine in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina on September the 11th, 2001. We all know that day. He deployed to Iraq in 2003. In May 2004, Corporal Shrag drowned during a covert crossing of the Euphrates River at Al Anbar province. On the right, Sergeant Weiner grew up in Lauderhill. Since childhood, he had dreamt of life in the military. He enlisted at 18, following his 3 older brothers into the armed forces. Weiner responded to nearly 200 calls involving IEDs and is credited with saving hundreds of lives. Weiner had returned to Iraq for his second tour and was killed in January 2007 while disarming a vehicle-borne IED in Baghdad. Major Wolfer, at the top, grew up in Carl Springs, Florida. He was an intelligence officer who was killed on April 6, 2008, during his 3rd tour in Iraq, when there was a rocket attack on the gym where he was exercising. On the right, Airman First Class Elizabeth Jacobson of Riviera Beach, Florida, enlisted in the Air Force in 2004 and was deployed to Iraq as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom. On September 28, 2005, she was killed when her vehicle made contact with an IED near Safwan. Airman First Class Jacobson was the first female airman killed in the line of duty in Operation Iraqi Freedom. She was honored by the Air Force with the establishment of the Elizabeth N. Jacobson Award for Expeditionary Excellence. A street on Ali al-Salim Air Base was named Jacobson Avenue. The Jacobson Training Center was named for security force members at Lackland Air Force Base, Texas. And the renaming of the main gate at Goodfellow Air Force Base, Texas, was renamed the Jacobson Gate. Airman First Class Jacobson was awarded 12 medals. In the center, born in Hollywood, young Mark Rosenberg wanted to join the military like his father had. Rosenberg enlisted in the Army in 1996 and was deployed to South Korea, completing a tour in Iraq, and was promoted to major. In 2007, he was again deployed to Iraq as part of the Military Intelligence Tactical Team, military training the Iraqis in military training. On April the 8th, 2008, Major Rosenberg was killed when his Humvee struck an IED in Baghdad. He was awarded many medals. War journalists would rather tell the story than be the story. One of the most tragic stories is of dual American Israeli citizen and journalist Stephen Sotloff, who was beheaded by ISIS on international television on September the 2nd, 2014 in Syria. Born and raised in Miami, a grandson of Holocaust survivors and a UCF, University of Central Florida, journalism graduate, Sotloff studied Hebrew and Arabic in Israel and Yemen so he could tell human interest stories about the Middle East conflict. You likely remember the news story in October of 2020 that the US brought 2 ISIS militants to Virginia for a federal trial. These 2 men were part of the group that kidnapped, tortured, and murdered Stephen Sotloff and 3 other Americans. In 2022, the murderers were sentenced to life without parole. Here, killing eclipsed politics and war. When US airstrikes halted ISIS advance across northern Iraq, Islamic State responded with a form of information warfare that it knows will horrify most people in the West and hopefully keep the US out of the Middle East. Sotloff worked for many, that's Sotloff in the picture. I have to just take a breath every time I look at this because I knew Steve. You must have known Stephen, David. Sotloff worked for many publications, including Time magazine. Its editor said Stephen gave his life so readers would have access to information from some of the most dangerous places in the world where we are at war. Commander Barbara Fieldman from Orlando served in Operation Desert Storm as a blood program officer for all the troops in the Persian Gulf region. She helped to form the J Group congregation, a group of Jewish military personnel. A native of Miami, Colonel Bien Letibien retired in 2007 after 30 years of service in the Army and Army Reserves. On the right, another Miami native, Commander Simon, has served in intelligence positions in Japan, Bahrain, Miami, Guantanamo Bay, and Iraq. Currently, she is intelligence officer for Carrier Strike Group 3. Simon has many medals and has served as a Jewish lay leader wherever she has been. The Fages brothers are from Jacksonville. Malcolm Fages retired in 2004 as a vice admiral as a 3-star after a 36-year career and many medals. His brother Sheldon retired in 1991 after a 20-year career. 4 consecutive generations of the Abramowitz family have served more than 100 years and earned a total of 33 individual medals. Private Reuben Abramowitz in the top left enlisted for World War I at age 14. His son, Lieutenant Ben Abramowitz, served from 1955 to 1983, and all 3 of Ben's sons and a grandson have served in the Army. Lieutenant Colonel Reuben Abramowitz served at Fort Monmouth from 1921 to 1949 as a radio instructor. Also in 2004, the new communication center at Fort Gordon, Georgia, was also dedicated to Reuben Abramowitz. It was very interesting to find 7 Florida Jewish generals. Did you know that? General Barkin is a gastroenterologist. And on the right, from 2007, Lieutenant General Fridovich was director of the Center for Special Operations at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa. There he retired as the senior Green Beret in 2011 after 37 years of service. Admiral Benjamin is from Miami. I don't think he's related to the Pioneer Benjamin family. Maybe he is, I don't know. He's from Miami. He enlisted in the Navy during World War II and served 40 years. On the right is Major General Weiss, who received his commission through the ROTC program and entered the Air Force in 1956, serving 32 years, mostly involved with ballistic missile early warning systems and space track stations. Jacksonville native Captain Zacharias attended the Naval Academy class of 1912 and was assigned to the battleship USS Arkansas, which transported President Taft to see the Panama Canal in 1912. During World War I, he was an engineering officer and then a gunnery officer. After the war, Zacharias became an attaché to the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, Japan. And during the 1920s and early 30s, he interacted with many of the high-ranking Japanese military leaders. In 1934, he became officer in charge of the Far Eastern Office of Naval Intelligence. Captain Zacharias predicted in March of 1941, that if the Japanese started a war, it would be an aerial attack on the American fleet on a Sunday morning. During World War II, Captain Zacharias commanded the heavy cruiser USS Salt Lake City in the Gilbert and Marshall Islands and helped escort Lieutenant General James Doolittle's raiders. Was Deputy Director of the Office of Naval Intelligence from 1942 and 43, commanded the battleship USS New Mexico, and then became Chief of Staff of the 11th Naval District. Because he was fluent in Japanese and had been a close student of Japanese society and culture in the interwar period, he participated in breaking Japanese morale through his radio broadcast in Japanese, directed at the homelands and specifically to their leaders. The 12th broadcast that transmitted U.S. President Harry Truman's message was answered by Japanese Premier Suzaki, who asked about the status of Emperor Hirohito. Zacharias responded anonymously, and then the Japanese accepted Allied surrender terms August 14th of 1945. Captain Zacharias was awarded the Silver Star for a secret Office of Strategic Services mission that penetrated the Italian High Command to divert the Italian fleet in 1943. He was promoted to Rear Admiral upon his retirement in 1946 and then narrated the NBC TV series Behind Closed Doors. Anyone remember that? He wrote several books, and his son Ellis Jr. was also a graduate from the Naval Academy and served. As a transition back to civilian life here in Jacksonville, in 1994, the NFL awarded its 30th franchise, the Jaguars, co-owned by Lawrence Dubow. Dubow remained an owner until 2011 and was on the board when Jacksonville hosted the Super Bowl here in 2005. Last year, the family of Lawrence Dubow made a substantial donation to the Jewish Family and Community Services that their initials have been added to the nonprofit's name to ensure the organization's future. The organization was founded in 1917. Dubow came from a family of pharmacists, and he followed the same career path. He served in the Korean War, where he was a pharmacist attached to a MASH unit. And he told me it was just about like you saw on television. After the war, he worked as a pharmacist in Jacksonville and eventually became a giant in wholesale pharmaceuticals and a major community activist and philanthropist. Jacksonville matured into a large regional business center with banking, insurance, healthcare, and a military hub. Jews here have been represented in all sectors of the economy, from the arts to sports, from media to political professions to construction and development. Entrepreneurs like Morris Wolfson, who never learned to read or write English, worked to improve the quality of life for their city. Born in 1879 in Lithuania, Wolfson married Sarah Goldberg in Baltimore and moved to Jacksonville in 1913. He was a junk man and a scrap metal dealer who built a family empire. Sam, one of his sons, brought AAA baseball to Jacksonville, and Sam, Saul, and Cecil all served in World War II. The Wolfson's family name is on many Jacksonville institutions, including hospitals, schools, ball fields, and River Garden Home for the Aged. Lewis Wolfson, a grandson of Morris and a millionaire by age 28, was owner and breeder of Affirmed, Florida's first Triple Crown winner, who held that title for 37 years. Wolfson bought the Ocala farm where Affirmed was bred and trained in 1959 when he was chairman of New York Shipbuilding Corporation, which built the world's first nuclear-powered merchant vessel. Florida has had one Jewish governor, Daytona's David Schultz, who was inaugurated in 1933. Schultz entered politics as a member of the Florida House of Representatives in 1917. However, when the U.S. entered World War I, he resigned to enlist in the U.S. Navy. Schultz served as governor for 4 years. He was a dynamic public speaker. He took the reins of state government when the worst effects of the Depression were being felt here in Florida. He paid the bills, distributed free public school books, and gave more money to schools than ever before, and started commissions to serve the public good. After leaving office, he practiced law in Miami. Some Florida Jews are famous and some are infamous, like Meyer Lansky, whose career was crime, but the government could never convict him. He was a member of the synagogue that became the Jewish Museum of Florida, and there is a stained glass window dedicated to him there. He lived on Miami Beach since the 1930s when he began his gambling on Miami Beach. The chairman of the board on the left is shown with his sons, Paul and Buddy, in 1942 on Miami Beach. He died at Mount Sinai Hospital on Miami Beach in 1983 at the age of 81. And I always get asked about his sons since I showed a picture. They want to know if they went into the family business. Buddy actually had cerebral palsy and he died in 1989. But Paul went to West Point, class of 1954, took a commission in the, you're probably wondering how this involves the military, right? Well, Paul took a commission in the Air Force and became a pilot. In 1962, he was sent by President John Kennedy to Vietnam as an advisor. He retired from the military and went to work for Boeing in Seattle, eventually working on the Apollo space program. So there you go. Jews are like cut flowers. We die without roots. These stories are our collective historic memories, our roots. I've shared much less than 1% of the stories I gathered in my 40 years of research throughout Florida and about 8% of the images in my book. What I learned is that history helps us understand society and change. Our memories of history are what define us. We need to hear the stories, preserve them, and pass them down to those who follow us. The stories of people inspire us to take action in our own lives. I hope these stories add some joy and meaning to your own life. Obviously, I could not show every Florida Jew in the military, but our minds can absorb only what our tushies can endure. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for your attention, and thank you each and every one of you for your service. If you are inclined to purchase my book for yourself, a friend, a child, or a grandchild, please see me, and Joy Zerivitz is going to help me in the back, and I can inscribe a book for you. Thank you so much.
You know,
Thank you.
if there's anyone with a question, the microphone is on. Mary Jo. She has agreed to take a question or 25. Please step up. Questions? You got off with time served. You got off with time served. No questions? On behalf of the National Museum of American Jewish Military History, it is my pleasure and my honor to present to you a certificate from our museum. I would ask that you show it. We were very proud to have you here to enjoy your presentation. And while you concentrated on Jews in Florida, you did us proud because every one of us who served, and everyone in this room served in some fashion, either actively or as a family member. And we thank you for preserving our good name forever. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. But for those who are interested, there's tea and crumpets out the door. Well, if not, we have actually tea and beverage and brownies and cookies. So, and again, thank you for coming. Yeah.